more questions for these folks from the audience, so that's a good thing. Welcome. My name is Larry Gerbrandt. I'm media analyst, and I've been a principal of my own valuation company, Media Valuation Partners, since 2007. I also sit on the board of probably one of the most successful basic cable networks that you've never heard of. It's called INSP, or Inspiration TV, consistently top 40 rated basic cable network, totally ad-supported, family-oriented programming. And I'm not trying to do a pitch for the network. It's just they're not necessarily looking for more publicity, just more viewers. Anyway, let's get on with the panel. And we're going to be discussing the economics and the availability of capital for the music, television, and motion picture business, and the impact of all the new windows. As some of you may already have heard, Disney Plus launched last night, and it was so successful, it crashed. So had I been home, I would have been one of those who would have been repeatedly hitting the button, trying to find out what was going wrong. So very high-class problem. I would have thought that Disney, of all companies, would have had the resources in place. They knew how they had 2 million people sign up before the service ever launched. But it gives us an indication of where this sector is going, and the consumer demand has not been satiated. I think what we're going to do here is have each of the panelists introduce themselves, give us a little background on their area of expertise, and then we'll start with the panel. So, Megan?
Okay, we didn't try these out, but you can hear me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my name is Megan Jones, and I am a tax attorney primarily. I work at a firm called Withers Worldwide, and so Withers is a 100-year-old London-based law firm. We say we're a private client firm, so that means we deal with individuals, although we touch everything that they have. So we've got a corporate unit, we've got a litigation unit, we've got tax, trust, and estates, and we have a fair number of entertainment-related clients, and so the fun part of my job is negotiating things like agreements where one of our artists is getting ownership of a company just for promoting a product, or one of the guys in our office right now has a client who's buying an island. I have looking at my phone all morning because I have an art deal closing this week if I can make it happen, and then we just do basic things like sell businesses or help start businesses. I was, for a while, when I started my career, I was an investment banker in Silicon Valley working in the high-tech industry. I grew up with a dad who's in the high-tech industry, so I have kind of the finance side, the business side, and then also now the legal side. And one of my friends, Matt, is in the audience, and Matt knows that nothing gets me more excited than spreadsheets and the tax code.
A lady after my own heart. I mean, I build spreadsheets for entertainment purposes. So
Yeah, no, that's great.
Seth?
You two are going to get along. Larry and I used to be business partners, and I've never seen somebody get so excited about pivot tables. I still don't really know what they are. I'm Seth Shapiro. I've worked in digital and television for 25 years. Larry knows this, but I actually moved out here from New York, and my girlfriend and I timed our arrival here to go to this weird thing at the Beverly Hilton called Digital Hollywood in January of 1994. So that's disturbing on a lot of levels. I kind of best known for, I ran a games division at Disney, and then I ran all interactive services at DirecTV. So I launched TiVo. I launched all the NFL original Sunday Ticket, digital services for sports. Went on to do, I think, 60 different interactive TV services, then left to do a JV with Comcast, which actually David over there and Larry were both involved with, and then went on to do a number of OTT services, which I think we're going to be talking about today. And then I launched a network for DirecTV, and then started a new business with IBM, which was an OTT tech stack connected to a blockchain that Larry was involved with. And now, actually, we're going to be launching with some new partners next week, a company devoted to bridging relationships between Hollywood and Asia, primarily Seoul. So I've been working with KOKA, who some of you may know, which is the Korean foreign ministry here. The guy who runs that, Chul Min, has become a good friend, and I think that's going to be for those of you who haven't seen Parasite, I think that's just kind of the beginning of what we'll see as a real Asian wave coming here. So I'm hoping to participate in that.
Greg?
Great. So I'm Greg Bedrosian. Great to see everyone this morning. I come from the finance side of the equation. I'm a co-founder and CEO of a tech and media-focused investment bank called Drakestar Partners. We have 10 offices worldwide. I'm based in our New York office, but I'm out here in LA quite regularly. For that part of the business, we advise both growth stage companies and some of the world's largest media and tech companies on mergers and acquisitions and financings. Outside of my day job, I'm also a senior advisor of a media and entertainment investment fund called MEP Capital. At MEP, we invest in music, film and TV, sports entertainment related businesses with a very structured equity with downside protection as a key theme. For that business, we invest sort of in the $10 million kind of ticket range. On the investment banking advisory side, we tend to work with larger transactions. So I can come at it from both what the big guys are thinking and what many of you, I'm sure, are content creators in the audience, what you're thinking about and how we look at structuring deals.
Well, in that vein, let's find out who is in the audience. How many in here are in the film business? How many in the television business? How about any digital services, OTT? Okay. And how many in the music business? Okay.
And how many performers? Who actually performs too? Okay.
Gaming?
Good.
Go ahead. Any other sectors?
No, I just said gaming.
Oh, gaming. Okay. Got it. Got it. Very good. I think we're going to start the panel with Greg, and to address specifically, and then we'll move down the panel. We want to talk about how the launch of all these new OTT services, which acquire a totally different set of rights than we're used to. I mean, the windows were always very predictable, even for television. You kind of knew, you produced it, you knew who you were going to sell it to, what the back-end structure was. All of those rules have changed. So the question is, how do the new deal structures between the distributors and the content owners change the investment structure? So, because ultimately it's the profit or the back end that traditionally investors have put the money up for. So we'll start with Greg and work our way down.
I'm sure we can all add value to that question, and everyone has seen the launch of Disney Plus. It's everywhere. Even Bloomberg Business, has Mr. Iger there with the grimace. He's going for it. Look, there's a number of variables. The paradigm has changed, and from the investment side at MEP Capital, where I sit, it's interesting because you have Netflix and Amazon. I've got some numbers that our firm even pulled together. Netflix, $15 billion of content investment. Amazon, $7 billion. A teeny bit of that is sports, but mostly entertainment. Apple, $3 billion, but growing. Those are all new players who are structuring new deals with the content creators. you'd think, and one would imagine, outside of the big tentpole films, right, that are funded by the big studios and they're hundreds of millions of dollars, which maybe some of you were involved in creating, but I imagine most of the audience here is more focused on the indie, high growth opportunities. Outside of those tentpole films, you'd figure that the Amazons and whatnot are coming in and they're spending billions of dollars. Fascinatingly enough, at MEP Apple, we've had more deal flow of really interesting film and TV opportunities. Maybe it's because content creators are feeling like there's more capital out there and they're pushing new opportunities. We've just funded, for example, a Janitors in Space type film with Bruce Willis, and on the more creative side, a UK-based film, a remake of Oliver Twist with Michael Caine as the star and Lena Headey of Game of Thrones. How did we structure those deals, and why are we even in those conversations, right? So we structured those deals, and it's a little bit unique to our fund, but with downside protection. So there were a lot of the back end was actually pre-sold in a bunch of different territories. And then, whether it be the UK or the Bruce Willis film is being done in the state of Georgia, tax credits and other things, there's a way of wrapping transactions where funds like ours are actually certainly taking risk, but our downside is reasonably well protected. The flip side is you've got the Netflixes of the world that are throwing out very substantial upfront guarantees to the content creators. And I think there's a little bit of a yin and a yang between those two kind of structures, big upfront versus more manage the risk on the back end. But let me pause there because I know my panelists have a number of other thoughts and ideas to add to that. But that's the dynamic. It's all being figured out.
Just to stay on that just for a moment, I've been around the industry long enough to remember where I remember investment tax credits. And especially rich oil people in Texas loved them because they needed to diversify their money, and they could actually make money on their investment with essentially no downside risk. Then we went through the era of pre-sales, where between HBO and the international territories, you again had, especially in independent film, you could pretty much pre-sell the movie and get it paid for, maybe a little gap financing. But the real money, of course, was in the back end, and it got much better when the DVD came along. Are we kind of back in a way to where we used to be, that the upfront risk has gone down, but the back end rewards are not there anymore?
I think the back end rewards are a little bit TBD, in part because of the various streaming distribution channels that you're referencing, and the math and the economics are a little less clear on that. That's my vantage point, but my esteemed panelists maybe have other views too. They're living this day to day as well.
Well, Seth, why don't you take a stab at that then?
Well, I think everything you said was spot on. There's a number of different ways to look at this, and I wrote a book called Television in, I guess, about 5 years ago, and did a lot of research into there, because I've always been a digital guy. I got really interested in how this business started in the first place, and one of the things that was interesting was in the salad days of the big three, or called big four networks, there were about 60 to 80 scripted shows a year, which is astounding now when you consider that there's over 500, and depending on how you look at, over 1,000. I mean, it's hard to overstate just how much content production has increased. So that's one factor here. There are just so many more shows being made that nobody can keep track of all of them. I was at a meeting yesterday, a development meeting on another one of the shows that we're doing, and I found out that one of the top shows on Netflix is a glass blowing show. Have any of you even heard of it? It's extremely economically efficient. How much could it cost to do a show on glass blowing? And in terms of their key demos, it's really returning for them. So in one of my production meetings, we wound up, and I'd never even heard of it. So the production has obviously gone through the roof. I think to try and bound this, because there's so many ways to skin this, it's going to be really interesting as Disney Plus, HBO Max, Apple, and Netflix and others, so Viacom has Pluto, but let's talk about the big four. The models are the same but also different. So for example, HBO, as many of you know, has generally sold the content in different territories because HBO isn't in every territory. So that's already a difference. Stanky can say, you know, what he wants on the content that HBO is going to have, but Warner is going to have some, Warner Studios, which is part of AT&T now, is going to obviously have some difficult decisions to make because they open movies throughout the world. How many of those, what are those windows going to be look like when a show that traditionally would have been sold into a traditional broadcaster in other markets in the world is now part of a streaming service? What's that going to look like? Some of you may remember when Netflix started original content. House of Cards was, I believe, on broadcast television in the UK. Why? Because Netflix wasn't in England then. So in terms of where all these rights decisions are going, it's a fascinating chessboard. A good friend of ours who did the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon deal, his sort of, and has done very elaborate movie financings, said, so 7 years ago he would have said, well, you've got a choice. If you're doing a movie, you can go out, take it out theatrically and roll the dice, or you can have Netflix come in and perhaps say, okay, we're going to give you 150% of your cost, and we're taking the world for a decade, and there's your choice, right? So you got a capped return. You got no distribution anywhere else. You gave up the film for a decade, and you saw that. So it was binary. But I think, having been at a lot of these companies recently, the new guys, they just don't know. I mean, Disney and AT&T are really going to have to figure this stuff out as they go along.
Megan, you're welcome to talk about film and TV, but I know your specialty is music, and that business got disrupted faster and earlier than any of the others. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how the deal structures have changed and kind of where you think it's going, where it's going.
So I don't know why, as I'm sitting here and listening to my panelists who are very experienced, which is a good thing, not a bad, I'm starting to get nostalgic, and I'm thinking back to when I was here at this panel a number of years ago, and there's been this tension between the technology industry and the entertainment industry, and I remember my co-panelists not agreeing with me when I said that, because they were all saying that these technology companies were not going to come in and steal their business, and I pointed out that when you're sitting on $10 billion, it's really easy to hire good people to do things like that. And it's kind of played out in an interesting way. So we, and by the way, I was going to add at the beginning, but I didn't. I have a hard stop at 12:15 because I have a client call that started at 12, but that's fine. So I am actually going to get up at 12:15, but you can find me on the internet through my law firm. But we're seeing a lot of, so I've got this tension where I'm always a little bit more, I don't want to say it this way, but a little bit more understanding of the technology side. And again, that's because of growing up in Silicon Valley. And I also, years ago, had a billionaire investor friend of mine say to me about content. He said, who cares about content? It's the platform that matters. And when you talk about all this content out there, there's plenty of content for everyone. I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old, and I talk about my kids all the time here. My kids pay for content for the most part. My daughter used to bootleg some stuff, but it got just too complicated. And so now she pays, I pay for her content. And it's so inexpensive. And then we do a lot of free YouTube. It's a huge battle where, I'm going to digress for 1 second, then I'll get more into music because I do have a lot to say. My son is very influenceable at 16, and he's got a lot of the gaming world related videos that he watches, but then there's also some really creative, intelligent content on there. The problem is I watch makeup videos, and if anyone watches YouTube and knows of the Tati battles recently, I have had to listen to a 16-year-old complain about what an evil person my makeup guru is. So, that's the world we live in now today. But when we're talking about music, a lot of our clients, I mean, I don't even think so much about the content anymore, and this is just because of the kind of work I do. The content is really great. Like our musicians, they've created amazing, fabulous content. We had one who recently sold a film library, took up residency outside the United States because he was not a U.S. resident originally, and U.S. government didn't get any of those tax dollars. But he got a lot of money from it, and so he monetized an actual library of something that he wrote, and he's young. These people are very young sometimes. We also have a lot of musician clients. Again, it's not that their music should be discounted completely, but they are getting LLC interest in companies, and all they're having to do is show a product, at a concert or in a video or whatever, and all of a sudden they get 20% of the company. So yeah, the music is nice, but there are all these other things. We also work some with business managers. And when you talk about movies, we have one, we just put together a very complex deal where we don't know who the investors are. It's anonymous. We prepare the documents and then the name is written in and signed. But basically these are people in the entertainment industry who are getting film credits. Very complex, under California law, way of getting a tax advantage. But when you're a really successful entertainer, those tax advantages can make a huge difference. I was at another panel and someone was talking about George Clooney. Does anyone know how George Clooney sold a company for $1 billion? Did you know this? I did not know this. Tequila.
Yeah, custom dose.
Amazing. And so again, yes, he makes great content. I like him in movies. He's fabulous. But there are all these other opportunities now when someone's built the name. And so when you think about, okay, you're a musician, you're an artist, you're a creator, you can start small these days and you can make a video and you can put it on YouTube and you can start developing a client base and you can network with other YouTubers. I mean, I know way too much about this because of my kids, but you can actually build a platform and a name for yourself. There are people like Billie Eilish, again, about a 16 and 18-year-old, who built their career entirely off of the YouTube opportunities. And once you can just get that little in, you're known and you have a reputation, then to me it's not, and again, I come from the technology industry, it's not about the content anymore, it's about the brand and what you can do with the brand.
Since you talk about your kids, I'll talk about mine, actually my grandkids. I worked for years to close down Bank of Dad. I used to joke that was tattooed on my chest. Now turns out it's the Bank of Granddad, and I have 4 grandchildren. They all know my Apple iTunes password, and I've recently...
I know my Amazon, so I get my Amazon password.
Yeah, and I've recently had to put some rules on how many things you can order and download off of iTunes. The bills were getting pretty large. When all you have to do is punch a button and it shows up on your screen, it's different. I'm actually going to answer a little bit of my own question. As I mentioned earlier, I sit on the board of INSP, and our network is, we've done very well with Westerns. Even old black and white Westerns do well. And our slogan is INSP, or Inspiration TV, where heroes are made. And we've been getting into making original content, mostly the old style made-for-TV movies, kind of in the Hallmark tradition. And while I can't give you specific numbers, we're able to do an hour-and-a-half movie for under $750,000. We're based in Charlotte. We shoot in Georgia, take advantage of the tax credits, do a theatrical window just so that we get, it's considered a theatrical release. The value goes up dramatically if you do that. We have a deal with Netflix where they get after the theatrical, they get a window, and then it comes to our network and we own it outright. I will say that even with all of that, we hope to break even. The goal is that over time you build up a library and you can use these over a very long period of time. But the economics are still somewhat challenging.
I think the economics are challenging, but I also think that because you have to spend less money, you can actually break into industries where maybe you couldn't break into them before. And you can find ways, if you look at it really as a business, as opposed to just being there for kind of the creative side of it, then you can build a really good long-term career. So you'd asked before about, okay, the economics, is there really economics at the end? And I guess I should have phrased it differently. There might not be economics at the end for that content, but there's economics at that end for the brand. And the economics are kind of sky's the limit, right? Again, I'll go back to who would have thought when I first saw George Clooney way back when that he would be a billionaire from selling a tequila brand, right? That was the last thing any of us would have expected.
I want to go back to Greg and then work way back down the panel. You talked about TBD, to be decided.
Yep.
What are the most promising new technologies or new ventures that you see beyond, now that we have all the big boys are in? What does that mean for some of the other opportunities? Does a Vimeo go away? Is there room for Pluto's doing streaming ad-supported, essentially linear channels, but you're in a position to see what comes next. So can you give us an idea of at least where some of the newest opportunities are?
Well, I mean, you're kind of hearkening to some of the distribution channels. I mean, I think that some of the biggest change, right, is the multi-screen and watching on, mobile devices, right? So technology, there's a entertainment tech guy in the audience, I don't know what your business does. Technology that is supporting that, and then I would also say we're seeing a lot of interesting things in the gamification of content, which you can look at in a couple of different ways. One is just from a branding perspective, I'm not even speaking about esports for a minute, but what's a video game versus what's scripted content, and how one watches that is evolving. But I also think there's technology around how people interact on a gaming platform that is actually used for a lot of other things, like some of the top global consulting firms, a little segue, but use gamification for interviews. So when you're being interviewed, you're not actually answering questions, you're actually playing this sort of obtuse video game that the way you're answering and playing somehow is in a view predicting whether you'll be successful or not in problem solving. So I actually see on the technology side things, it's beyond just I'm watching a show, I'm not watching a show, I'm watching it on my iPhone, I'm not. It's more changing how we actually interact, and I think some of those trends we're starting to see emerge.
Seth?
Technology, the next technology is on the forefront. Twitch, that's the future of a lot of this globally. Esports, so that's a whole. We go start talking about that. There goes the rest of the panel. So I'll just leave that there. But there's another trend going on which is really interesting. One of my former colleagues who's at Amazon now, is a very senior guy. He has a brunch every Christmas, and I went over there, and we're ex-cable guys, obviously, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but if you go to Amazon sometimes to watch a show, it will say you can get this show for 30 days. You've had this experience, subscribe to Package X, right? So you go, okay, great. So your kid wants to watch Yo Gabba Gabba, or you want to watch something on Acorn, so you say, okay, fine, and guess what? You're paying for that thing forever, right? So I realized that I'd been paying for one of these channels for like 2.5 years the other day. And but when it first started, I remember saying to my friend, because we were, cable guy, I said, "That was you, wasn't it?" And he kind of laughed. And I mean, because you're going to wind up seeing these cross-pollinations between what worked in the old world and what's going to work in technology with the new world, because so many of the business models that make sense are going to get reinvented. We're getting ready to do a pitch now, and we had a long conversation yesterday at the production company about, is this like, it's almost like we have to do two different pitches, one for the streamers and one for the broadcast networks, because the financial implications of some aspects of the show are so different. In some cases you're going to give up all of the rights, but you're going to retain these. The economic ramifications actually start to get pretty quickly into the creative of the show, and I think that's going to be really interesting. The best example I can think of quickly about that was when Narcos started. I remember watching the first few episodes and having this kind of weird professional feeling, like when this alarm goes off in your head, and I'm like, what is it about the show that's really hitting me? And I realized if I didn't know better, I would not know whether this was a Spanish language production company or an English language production company, because the show was the first season was sort of right down the middle. That was really the beginning of something big. And obviously we've had Chinese and American production companies. We're talking to Korean companies about that, but I think that's a whole other level on top of this.
I think there are a whole bunch of areas which are really exciting. Just to start with his last point, which wasn't where I was going to start, but that's okay. We're seeing a lot of kind of global cross-border content creation and funding, and that's pretty exciting. Just really interesting projects. People here, people in another country, and then they're deciding to make some project elsewhere, and then where are they going to distribute it? It's really interesting. It's complex, but it's really fun. When I think about the technology, I think about the gamification games, right? That's a really huge one. They continue getting more sophisticated. I think of interactive, especially where you can have other people, immersed either physically or online with each other. But I also think one of the really big things, if you're in the content industry or the technology industry, which we need to think about, is artificial intelligence. I mean, artificial intelligence is this thing that's going to hit someday, but yet we're using artificial intelligence every day. When I get my recommendations anywhere, whether it's Amazon or Google or YouTube, it's all artificial intelligence driven. Even now, I think there was a statistic that something like 75% of top 20 songs are going to be at least partially written by artificial intelligence somewhere in 5 years or so. And so what's going to happen going forward is going to really change what content is. Let's say you do work with your AI guy, your AI, and he's helping you write a song or helping you craft a better script or helping you craft a better visual image. That's going to be something that will really change what content is. I've been working on a project on and off on the taxation of artificial intelligence, and it's like, how do you define some of this stuff? If my computer goes off and creates something and I don't know about it, do I own it? I mean, probably, yeah, based on the way the laws are written today, but can I find it? And so this is stuff that, right now, our phones are not even close to running our lives, but in 5 to 10 years, they're going to be smart, way smarter than we are, and they're going to start having our house lights on when we get home and making sure the only content we see is stuff that we're going to like. I mean, all kinds of stuff that I'm trying to put it in words, but the practical reality is they're going to be so much smarter than I am, I probably will never be able to fully articulate it.
What about 5G? This is my last question, then we're going to go to the audience for questions. I keep hearing that it's going to completely change the entertainment and the music business.
5G is, the Chinese government is actually investing big time in 5G, and we're not. So it's rolling out there. That's where a lot of the support for the artificial intelligence is going to come from.
Well, I know they've made that both AI and 5G sort of national priorities. My question for the panel is, do any of you have any insights on how 5G, when it does finally roll out in this country, how it's going to change the business?
Well, effectively all right, so if you're a telco, so I'm part of a company called VideoCoin, and we talk about this a lot, and actually we brought the former CTO of Fox over, and that's his main project. If you start thinking about televisions or screens from the perspective of a telco, every television is just another panel. And you start thinking about smart cars, they become more sources of more panels. And there are all of these devices all over the place that potentially get panels on them. And the more you have sort of shorter wave, more location-based transmission, the more narrowcasting and the more transmission you can do, the more. So if you kind of want to look at OTT as this trend from broadcasting to narrowcasting, I think 5G brings that to a whole other level, potentially brings that to a whole other level of specificity. From an economic perspective, it really moves potentially a lot of the way to mobile carriers and new transmission. It's bad news for coax, for example, right? So there's a lot of economic implications in different territories too.
Although, does it wipe out the high-speed access business from, for instance, it's what funds Comcast these days, is they're selling 100 megabit per second internet access. Does that go away and get replaced by 5G?
No, I don't think it goes away, but it's potentially the more screens there are out of home, that'll eventually have. So, I mean, the big move for the traditional MSOs or MVPDs in that sense was this move from the living room based TV to these whole home solutions, and how many devices can your Comcast router or your DirecTV whole home solution deal with now. That's gonna probably accelerate that race for them. They'll have to do more, specific. They'll have to provide more streams, I would imagine.
Okay. We're going to open it up to the floor for questions. Just raise your hand. Introduce yourself and go ahead.
I'm Julia Pierpont. I'm a writer, producer, director, but I'm also a Hollywood liaison for Shinhwa News Agency in China. Excuse me, I'm very curious from each of you to hear what are the most deals that are being done, what area. You mentioned television at one point, but what are the bulk of the deals you're seeing happening at the moment?
I'm seeing a variety of deals, and so I think mine is more anecdotal. I looked at where funding is these days, and I think that it's still kind of centering around bigger. It's harder to get when you're younger, earlier stage. It's a lot easier to get when you're an established company. So I think on the funding side, when I think about my anecdotal side, what we're seeing, like I mentioned earlier, artists getting ownership and stakes in companies to help promote a product. We're seeing film deals, but they're a little bit more global and creative. I mean, we're working with one right now where it's one of the top talent agencies, but it is a very dispersed global project. And so it's like 50 people on a phone call kind of thing. But it will happen because they have the funding for it, so it's a guarantee. I think we're also, we don't do a lot, I was saying to Larry earlier, we don't do a lot with the studios, so we're really dealing more with the individuals and the artists and seeing what they're getting access to. We're still getting, for the bigger people, bigger names, they're still getting the traditional deals, obviously. But I think that's and then there's a lot of sales of things that people have built, whether it's a music library, whether it's a technology company. We have a lot of startup companies that have a Chinese element to it because a lot of those people want to come live here, so they establish residency here. A lot of that. So.
You said 20%, by the way, just to follow up. Talent is getting up to 20%, or is 20%?
What have I seen? I saw a deal recently where talent got 25% of the economics. I saw another one where they got about 12% of the economics. And that's just for coming in and there's one that we worked with, and they initially did one deal and the product exploded. It just, like, as soon as it's just all it's unbelievable. It's sold out at Walmart kind of thing.
So, in terms of sectors, the thing formerly known as television is still really big. You can define it different ways. So, quick example. So, my friends at Talpa in the Netherlands actually got deployed to China. They do the voice. So, when the format sold in China, I think the executives in China in charge of that one made a really good decision, which is they actually brought the guys who had built it in the Netherlands over to be consultants. And so that's a really interesting area here because it's sort of still one of the main things that I'd suggest Hollywood's really good at. Hollywood makes really high quality, visually appealing, tight television, and not every market in the world has that. So that's been an interesting market. And then, the format business is super interesting. I remember being in Brazil in 11 or 12, and I think that was the first time I realized it was actually a business back then even between K-dramas in Korea and Brazilian telenovelas, because they're not that different. They have a lot in common. And I think those are super interesting things. They're all kind of on the broad rubric of what you'd call television. So I guess, that's where I see the most action.
I mean, just to round out, I would say, especially in terms of cross-border flows, which may be relevant for you, it's certainly relevant for what my firm and I do. Inbound, I agree, it tends to be content-focused, meaning Europe and especially Asia looking to find a way of tapping what Hollywood and content creators here still do in an exemplary fashion. And I think the other end, the flip side, tends to be more technology-driven, and we're also seeing a really big uptick in sports-related investing, but both, again, picking up on your Asian angle, but both directions. But and a lot of that being driven by, as you've seen, the big players, the big tech players buying sports rights, not necessarily for TV, but for other platforms, and the value of live, whether it be we're talking about concerts or live sporting events or live other events in a tech-enabled world. We're all seeing, I think, the value of those live events actually going up dramatically. And so there's not only big tech corporates accumulating those, but there's more entrepreneurial entities kind of starting to scoop up portfolios of those. And I think that's a trend that will continue and is something that we should be on the lookout for.
Hi, my name is
Yeah.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. No, please.
Sorry. Hi, my name is June Lee. I consult for an esports network. I'm also a former founder of an American Asian network. I'm a cable space person too, and I also consult for the Africa channel, and I'm also creative. So I'm a little all over the place. So my question is, who do you guys? There's so much going on, right? And brands are being built, and content is not necessarily getting a return on investment, but the brand is increasing, and who gets to capture that? My question is, who is poised to capture the most? Is it the artist? Is it the platform? Is it you know what I mean? As an investor, making decisions on where you make investments, and as the kind of legal side who's drawing up the investments, I'm very curious as how people are thinking through the structure of things.
That's a really interesting question, because there was something I wanted to mention at some point. I wasn't finding a way to fit it in, so I'm going to fit it in and then I'll get to your answer. We looked at the Netflix 10K, and I know not everyone here is excited by numbers the way I am, but if you look at the Netflix 10K, you can really learn a lot about their business, because as you look at the international side of their business, they lose more money the more they distribute. So they've obviously decided that they're going to make that investment, and they're heavily, heavily leveraged. So Netflix is betting big on a big upside. They're going to need to make money to pay off the debt that they have. So obviously, if you are a large platform, there's tremendous upside if you can capture and keep your audience, right? We all agree that YouTube is doing just fine. But this is where I'm always the most optimistic panelist. I might not be this time, but I'm usually the most optimistic panelist because I just think there's so many opportunities. You know, we hear about music that was destroyed and no one knew how to respond to what happened online, and then all of a sudden now we have all these incredibly successful musicians who are starting either online or who develop a brand or who go on to really build a business. So I don't know that it's an easy one to say who will get the most money. The big companies will get the most money because they're the biggest and they have the most to invest. But I think there's tremendous amounts of opportunity and money out there for the people that do something different, unique, and distinctive that touches the audience.
That's a good question. The thing that I think about is when you asked your question is at the Milken conference, I guess it was about 5 years ago, there was a panel that had Bob Iger, and Peter Chernin. Peter Chernin was still the head of Fox, and they asked him what makes a successful CEO of one of these companies, and Chernin gave this great answer, which is the job of those of us up here is to build new business models faster than the old ones erode, and to the extent that we do that, you'll see us back up here next year, and to the extent that we won't, we won't. I kind of think about every client that way. So NBC Broadcast is a client. I remember when Steve Burke invested in, the head of NBC, invested in Snap. And so we were trying to do things with them at Snap. I mean, I think at most of these companies, people are trying, but whether it's a distributor or a studio or a tech platform, it is a bit of a free-for-all, which is super exciting. And I think everybody right now has a tremendous a historically significant upside, but everybody could be done. Everybody could crap out. Everybody could, there's no entrenched, there were companies before that just couldn't fail. I think everybody right now, because there's so much debt for one thing, from the big guys, and because the old models are eroding so fast. It's kind of an amazing time where, we will have breakout players in esports to what you do 4 years ago that aren't even on kind of the global map right now.
Thank you. My name's Edwin Stepp. I have a production company. I produce documentary films, primarily working on some feature films now, and some branded entertainment ideas, mostly for OTT probably. We've talked a lot about the big players, Netflix, Apple, Amazon. Are any of you working with or seeing brands becoming content creators in the model of Red Bull, and what's happening in that realm? And where are the distribution points? Are we working with the Netflix, Amazons? What's happening?
So Netflix, I'll go real quick. So Netflix, generally speaking, has a prohibition against that kind of thing. They don't want to see brands. We'll see how long that can last. I was saying a bit ago that we have the show that we're about to take out, and it's going to Netflix, Amazon, NBC, and others, and that's a big part of it. Like, you have to figure out who you're selling to. I think the nature of brand integration and sponsorship is going to have to change. It's going to have to be, and I think it's an area where Asia, in some ways, is just ahead of us. It's going to have to. There's going to have to be more integration of advertising into programming in a way that Hollywood hasn't quite gotten its head around yet. Really, another quick anecdote, when Mad Men was originally developed, because my friends were involved in it, it was actually designed to go out to brands. That was actually part of the high concept of the show. They were going to bring brands into it, and the networks just were not having it. They're like, no, and they were also like, by the way, nobody's going to watch the show. So it just kind of goes back to the all-time greatest thing anybody ever said about show business, which is from William Goldman, which is that nobody knows anything.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so great. I mean, I like this crossover. We do a lot of crossover between technology and entertainment, or technology and fashion, and all that mix and stuff. But there's just so many creative people out there who do just such wonderful things. And because of how large our markets are now, you can succeed at a massive scale.
Yeah, I would just add, on the branding side, actually Red Bull and some of their peers or groups we actually work with, and they're defining the way that they're going to market as, completely different than some of the traditional media players. And so I think there will be a rise as they become more and more adaptive in terms of the passion level of the fans. I also think, even going down to the individual brand, as we were talking about earlier, the power of individuals, whether it's George Clooney who gets to, because he's super famous, create this brand, this beverage brand that sells for $1 billion, but or UCLA football players who will soon be able to monetize their own their own value, all the way through that spectrum. And so that's where I see a really interesting rise. Now, that doesn't mean everything's going to become $1 billion in terms of value, but I think that trend is continuing, and I think the technology enables that. But I think it's also sort of a logical extension, which again gets back to, which is one of my favorite quotes, of nobody knows anything, because all this in a year when we reconvene could be, in a completely different trajectory, which is why it's kind of fun.
I'll just add one anecdote, and then we'll get to your question. A number of years ago, I do a lot of expert witness work, and this one involved Procter & Gamble. And one of the things I learned was, the term soap operas, comes from the fact that Procter & Gamble still produces many of the soaps. It's a way of controlling the advertising. But they also own award shows, like the People's Choice Award. That's actually owned by Procter & Gamble. And there's actually quite a few others that of similar ilk that they own. And what they do is they take, let's say they take half the ad inventory. The profit comes from selling the other half of the ad inventory, but they get to control which advertisers come on so that they don't compete with theirs. It's a really good business model because ultimately they get free advertising. If they can sell the rest of the ad spots to cover the cost of production, their half of the ad inventory is free. So it's a very compelling model, and it's one that's been out there for literally decades. I've always been surprised more companies don't do it. Question.
Hi, my name is Katie Christian. I'm a former studio executive that just launched an audio-first media company to create fiction podcasts with a pipeline to film and television. We, of course, saw the success with Gimlet Media earlier this year, exiting for $230 million to Spotify. I'm really curious and interested in a venture-backed programming strategy, but when we normally go and look at the VCs that are investing, we see they're investing more in tech companies or tech-enabled companies, and then the ones that say they're investing in media companies, when we go and look at their portfolios, they're not necessarily content creation companies or what I, as a Hollywood exec, think of when I think of a media company. So very green question. When a VC says it's investing in media companies, are there certain categories of media companies that you find VCs are most interested in? And what kind of returns are they looking for? Because there are just less of these unicorn media companies that you might see in the tech world.
Right. Well, I mean, I'd be happy to chat afterwards and learn a little bit more about what you're up to, because we are looking at podcasting businesses. But I think, and I know a bunch of us have experience with venture and media don't really work together. I mean, and the Silicon Valley venture community especially, I like to use the analogy, they're trying to invest in Ferraris. And they want $1 billion public offering, the Ferrari making it around the track, but if they don't, they're fine if it crashes into the wall and blows up, because they only need 2 of 10 deals to work, and as long as they're really, really, 10 times their money, even more, the math all works for them. So what they kind of do is, the other 8, if they're crashing into the wall and your business is vaporizing, too bad for you and all your team, but they're kind of like, that it's just a statistic, right? And so it doesn't mesh well typically with media as you would define it coming from that. It's my bench point. I don't know if my panelists agree.
Content is really hard to value. And people that are in the finance world like to value things, and they don't like the idea of creative. Like, what does that mean? I have a mentor who ran Guitar Center, and he said something to me which was super interesting. He said the hardest thing about running Guitar Center was you had to run a business with a whole bunch of creatives. right? Because they're mostly musicians that work at Guitar Center. And so it's just a very different business model. I think if you're looking to make content, you're probably not going to get a lot of traditional VC money. You might, if you're really looking hard and heavy, see who has invested in like kind of businesses, because there might be one or two or three. And then also where we're seeing a lot of that type of investment, it's more angel, more an individual who's made a lot of money who likes that type of a business or knows that type of a business.
Well, yeah, to your point, exactly. That's why there are slates, because that's actually something that people, it's easier to get your head around, right? It's exactly right. Like, traditionally venture wants a 10x, or they want enough big hits to pay off the companies that fail. That sort of midline, the models that you used to build that sort of look at, over this package of rights, what can you expect? That's why the economic models that happen in media do, and they're different people. They're not traditional venture that do those by and large.
Yeah, I had, by the way, my company is called Media Valuation Partners, so it is possible to value things. So, but to your point, in one case, we did a massive statistical study on combinations of movies, in particular budget categories. And as long as you stay away from the really big budget stuff, we modeled what are the odds of any one movie being profitable, any 5 movies being profitable, and any 25 as a package being profitable. And as we ramped up, it turns out that 25 is actually about the sweet spot. If you take enough shots, one of those or more are going to work so that they pay for the whole slate. The odds on any one of them, you put all your bet on one horse, and that's the likelihood of that working on average is very low. So to your point, it's really about scale in many cases, which is why the studios have stayed around for so long. And guess what? If you look at the average studio slate, it's about 20 to 25 films. We have time for one last question. I saw your hand go up. So.
Hi, my name is Marley Roberts. I'm with my sister. I co-founded the Roberts Group, a film and television content company dedicated to creating meaningful content with a data-driven perspective. I'm interested in where technology is taking us and in where's the potential. So my question is, what part of the industry do you still feel is antiquated that hasn't really caught up yet? Where do you see the most potential in the implementation of AI and other emerging technology? Is it in the creation of content, or is it deciding what content to make or fund or distribute?
I'll answer part of that question, and I think we're seeing it now with something called deep fakes. But if you combine AI with the deep fake technology, I think there's going to be some very interesting content that comes out of that. So, there'll still be a human element in it. But, if you take the technology that created the latest Lion King film, which was so realistic, you had to kind of, it changed the viewing experience. And then you add in what can be done with the deep fake part of it and AI. I think somebody is going to crack that code, and probably fairly soon.
Well, so was the other part the antiquated? Broadcast networks are in trouble, obviously. They'll be, I think what they'll do, if this was part of your question, what they have to do to remedy is there'll be more appointment television, and they'll figure it out over time. In terms of AI, I always think, having done it on, been successful and completely failed at this, you should work on technology in terms of content if you really love the technology. If you don't have sort of an edge, in that technology, or it's not your thing, just let somebody else do it until you can find a way to apply it to your edge. And I'll give you a kind of a weird example, which is you guys are familiar with Masterclass. Watch Timbaland's Masterclass. So this guy has produced hit over hit after hit, and the series is essentially I started in the music business, so it's essentially this guy who's a big record producer, who's got two guys sitting there who are actually writing keyboard parts and drum loops, and those guys are really conversant. They obviously know theory, they know harmony, they know structure, but when Timbaland's giving them instructions, it's like, give me it more, and they're like able to translate into that to something. But when you're actually in the room coming up with media-based technology, it's a weird process, and it's kind of got its own language. And if you don't find yourself in this situation where you've got a great team to do it, it's really hard to catch up. It just sort of becomes like a lightning in a bottle thing. I launched TiVo at DirecTV. That was the right technology at the right time. There have been a lot of DVR technologies. That was the right UX. I think a lot of people pay for that IP now. But if somebody had said, hey, let's create a DVR to compete with that, they never would have gotten anywhere. So, whatever this was.
I don't have anything
Okay.
to add.
Since nobody's pressing us, we'll take, you're the last question then.
May I answer
Sure.
part of that question?
There you go.
I make software, write software patents. And does anybody work at YouTube? Okay, so I can say it. What YouTube does to find out what the audience wants to watch is they create what's called a content genome based on piracy. So what they do is they pay a company called Parrot Analytics to analyze BitTorrent. So all the torrents that are being streamed globally, they say, I want to watch this type of content, and they make that type of content. So they break it down into science. So data science, only YouTube's got it figured out. And that's really the antiquated part. Because most filmmakers don't know what the audience really wants to make. But YouTube, because of their analytics, is figured out. That's their secret sauce. They pay a lot of money for that. And I think the disruption is in breaking down the content genome per region, right? We're not watching the same content right here in this part of the world that they are in San Diego or in New York, but we're reporting as the US versus Europe, country by country.
Yeah, just to close, I used to work for Nielsen, and one of the things that always fascinated me was the fact that the number one show in the country is rarely the number one show in each of the 210 television markets. Matter of fact, it varies all over the board, and you're making it actually plays itself out in a lot of different ways, including elections. You know, the mistake is to think that this is a homogenous country and a majority think a certain way, and it's increasingly not so. And it's made its way back to content, which is why we now have so many niche content. The key, which YouTube has figured out, is how to aggregate all of those niches together.
Yeah, 65 years of content are uploaded to YouTube every single day.
Yeah.
And differentiating yourself in that, you'll win when you have the data science of your audience, what content they want.
I think we've come to the end. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Megan. And thank all of you for attending and contributing.
In New York.